He is the ultimate Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, a fearless raider, a cunning strategist, a man who claimed descent from the gods themselves. Millions around the world know his legend from the hit TV show Vikings. But the real story of the man behind the myth is far more brutal, far more complex, and far more shrouded in the mists of time. Forget the romanticized hero of the screen. The true history of Ragnar, if it can be pieced together from the fragmented sagas and conflicting accounts, paints a picture of a ruthless warlord, a figure who existed in a world of unimaginable violence, where survival depended on the edge of a sword and the favor of pagan gods. This Anatomy of Dread documentary will delve into the historical sources, the ancient Norse sagas, and the archaeological evidence to uncover the terrifying truth behind the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok. We will explore the brutal realities of the Viking Age, the psychological landscape of a warrior culture, and the dark deeds that forged the myths that still echo 1,000 years later. Prepare to have your understanding of Ragnar Lothbrok shattered. This is not the story you know. This is the true, brutal story of the real Viking warlord. The first and most important truth about the real Ragnar Lothbrok is that he is a figure shrouded in historical ambiguity. Unlike well-documented historical figures, there is no single definitive account of his life and deeds. Our understanding of Ragnar comes primarily from the Old Norse sagas, legendary tales written down centuries after the Viking Age, and from scattered mentions in other historical sources, often written by those who were the victims of Viking raids. This presents a significant challenge for the historian and for anyone trying to separate the man from the myth. The sagas, such as the Ragnarsona, the tale of Ragnar's sons, and the Gesta Danorum deeds of the Danes, are filled with heroic feats, mythical creatures, and divine interventions. They are epic poems designed to entertain and to glorify the Viking past, not necessarily to provide a precise historical record. From a psychological perspective, these sagas are crucial. They tell us not just about what the Vikings did, but about what they valued and the kind of heroes they admired. Ragnar, as depicted in these tales, embodies the ideal Viking warrior, courageous, cunning, ambitious, and blessed by the gods. He is often portrayed as a charismatic leader who inspires fierce loyalty in his men. However, we must be cautious about taking these sagas as literal truth. They were written down in a Christianized Scandinavia, often with a blend of genuine oral tradition and later embellishments. It is likely that the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok, as we know him from the sagas, is a composite of several historical figures and legendary archetypes, who were eventually merged into a single, iconic hero. Despite the challenges, there are threads of historical possibility within the sagas. Some historians believe that a powerful Viking leader named Ragnaris, who raided Francia, modern-day France, in the 840s and was eventually captured and executed, may be one of the historical figures who contributed to the legend of Ragnar. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also mentions various Viking raids and leaders during this period. Though none are definitively identified as Ragnar Lothbrok, the reality is, the true Ragnar may never be fully known. He may have been a single, extraordinarily successful and brutal warlord, whose deeds became the stuff of legend, or he may have been a symbol, a representation of the archetypal Viking raider with various historical figures and events becoming attached to his name over time. What we can be certain of is the world in which the legend of Ragnar thrived, a world of relentless violence, where power was seized by force, and the gods themselves were believed to favor the bold and the ruthless. To understand the potential reality of Ragnar, we must understand the brutal anatomy of the Viking Age itself. The Viking Age was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of a perfect storm of social, economic, and technological factors in late 8th century Scandinavia. Overpopulation and a shortage of farmable land created intense competition for resources and status. To be a man of importance, you needed wealth, land, and, most importantly, a reputation for ferocity and success in battle. The path to achieving this was not through farming, it was through raiding. The Vikings' greatest weapon was not the axe, but the longship. This was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a vessel that was both incredibly fast and had a shallow draft, allowing it to not only cross the open ocean but also to navigate far upriver, striking deep into the heart of unsuspecting kingdoms. The longship was a psychological weapon. Its sudden, silent appearance on a misty horizon was the stuff of nightmares for the coastal communities of Europe. Let's conduct a psychological autopsy of a typical Viking raid. It was not a chaotic, disorganized attack. It was a brutally efficient military operation, built on the principles of speed, surprise, and terror. The Vikings were masters of psychological warfare. They deliberately targeted soft, wealthy, and poorly defended locations, most famously, the Christian monasteries of England and Ireland. To the Vikings, who worshipped pagan gods like Odin and Thor, a monastery was not a holy place. It was a treasure chest, filled with gold, silver, and valuable manuscripts, and guarded by unarmed men who believed their only shield was prayer. The attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 is often considered the beginning of the Viking Age, an act of such brutal sacrilege that it sent a shockwave of terror throughout Christian Europe. The raid itself would have been a precisely executed act of overwhelming violence. The Vikings would appear from the sea mist, their dragon-headed ships a terrifying sight. They would storm the beaches, their warriors, some of whom were the legendary berserkers who fought in a trance-like fury, letting out blood-curdling war cries. Their goal was to create maximum panic in the first few moments, to shatter the morale of any potential resistance. The subsequent slaughter was not just about killing, it was about building a reputation. A reputation for ruthlessness was a Viking's most valuable asset. It meant that the next village might simply surrender its wealth without a fight. This is the anatomy of their dread. Their violence was not just an act of rage, it was a calculated business strategy. The real Ragnar Lothbrok, whoever he was, would have been a master of this brutal and effective form of psychological warfare. What kind of mind is capable of such relentless and seemingly remorseless violence? To dismiss the Vikings as simple, bloodthirsty barbarians is to fundamentally misunderstand their complex and sophisticated worldview. To conduct a true psychological autopsy on a figure like Ragnar Lothbrok, we must first dissect the core beliefs that shaped his reality. The Viking warrior was not just a raider, he was a man living within a powerful and demanding spiritual framework. At the heart of the Norse psyche was a profound and unwavering belief in fate or word. They did not believe in free will in the modern sense. They believed that every person's destiny the day of their birth, the course of their life, and the exact moment of their death was preordained, spun into a great cosmic tapestry by the Norns, the three female deities of fate. This belief was not a source of despair, it was a source of incredible psychological freedom. Imagine the mindset. If the moment of your death is already decided and cannot be changed, then there is no reason to fear it. Fear becomes a useless, dishonorable emotion. The only thing that truly matters is how you live and how you meet the fate that has been set for you. This belief created a culture that valued reckless, almost suicidal, bravery above all else. To die in your bed from old age was seen as a straw death, a shameful and unremarkable end. But to die in battle with a sword in your hand was the greatest honor a man could achieve. This brings us to the second pillar of the Viking mind, the pursuit of glory and renown. In a society without written history, a person's immortality was not guaranteed by books, but by the stories and poems that would be told about them after their death. A man's reputation, his, was the only thing that truly survived him, to be remembered in the sagas. To have your name sung by skalds in the great mead halls for generations to come, this was the ultimate prize. And the path to this eternal fame was through great deeds, which, in the Viking Age, meant success and brutality in raiding. The more treasure you plundered, the more enemies you defeated. The more terrifying your reputation, the greater your story would be. Ragnar Lothbrok's entire legend is a testament to this profound cultural obsession with fame. And finally, there was the promise of the afterlife. For a Viking warrior, the reward for a brave death in battle was a ticket to Valhalla, the great hall of the god Odin. Here, they would feast and fight alongside the gods, training for the final, apocalyptic battle of Ragnar. This belief system created a powerful incentive for violence. It transformed the bloody chaos of the battlefield into a glorious, sacred stage, a place where a warrior could prove his worth to the gods and secure his place in eternity. So, the mind of a Viking leader like the real Ragnar was a complex machine, driven by these three powerful psychological forces. The belief in an unchangeable fate removed the fear of death. The intense desire for a glorious reputation provided the motivation for a life of violence, and the promise of Valhalla gave that violence a divine purpose. When we understand this mindset, we begin to understand that the Viking raids were not just acts of piracy. They were a form of religious and cultural expression, a deadly performance designed for an audience of both men and gods. While a definitive, singular biography of Ragnar Lothbrok remains elusive, the sagas and some historical accounts point to a series of raids and conquests that may be attributed to him or the historical figures who contributed to his legend. These events, often brutal and strategically significant, offer glimpses into the possible reality behind the myth. One of the earliest and most consistently mentioned exploits associated with Ragnar is a series of raids on England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources document numerous Viking incursions during the first half of the 9th century. While no specific leader named Ragnar is always identified, the scale and audacity of some of these raids align with the character portrayed in the sagas. The Viking attacks on the wealthy and poorly defended monasteries of England, such as Lindisfarne and Jarrow as we discussed earlier, would have been prime opportunities for ambitious warlords to amass wealth and build a fearsome reputation. It is plausible that a leader, or several leaders, whose actions were later conflated into the figure of Ragnar, spearheaded such expeditions. The sagas often depict Ragnar as a cunning strategist, who used unconventional tactics, a trait that would have been essential for success against the more established armies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Another key area of activity linked to Ragnar is Francia, the kingdom of the Franks, modern-day France and parts of Germany. The historical figure of Ragnar, who led a significant Viking raid up the Seine River in the 840s and besieged Paris, is a strong candidate for one of the real-life inspirations for Ragnar. This raid, though ultimately unsuccessful in capturing Paris, would have been a major event, demonstrating the Vikings' ability to penetrate deep into continental Europe. Regin Horus was eventually captured and, according to some accounts, met a brutal end, possibly thrown into a pit of snakes, a fate that also befalls the legendary Ragnar in some versions of his saga. The sagas also credit Ragnar with expeditions into the Baltic region and even claims of voyages into the Mediterranean. While the historical evidence for these far-flung adventures is less certain, they speak to the ambition and reach attributed to the legendary figure. A successful Viking leader would have constantly sought new targets for raiding and new opportunities to increase his wealth and prestige. It's important to remember that the Viking Age was a period of intense conflict and upheaval. Numerous Viking leaders and groups operated independently, and their exploits may have become intertwined in the oral traditions that eventually formed the sagas. The real Ragnar may have been a particularly successful and brutal warlord, whose deeds inspired awe and fear, leading later storytellers to embellish his accomplishments and merge them with those of other notable Viking figures. Therefore, when we speak of the true, brutal story of the real Ragnar Lothbrok, we are likely talking about a composite figure, a reflection of the ambition, ruthlessness, and success that defined the most formidable Viking leaders of the early 9th century. His legend, though perhaps not entirely based on one single individual, captures the terrifying reality of an age defined by the longship and the axe. The end of a great Viking hero, according to the sagas, was never meant to be a quiet affair. It was meant to be a grand, dramatic, and often brutal spectacle, a final act that would solidify their legend and be sung about for centuries. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok's death is the very embodiment of this ideal. It is a tale of defiance, of prophecy, and of a terror that would echo long after he was gone. According to the most famous versions of his saga, an older Ragnar, still driven by an insatiable hunger for glory, decided to launch a final audacious raid on the kingdom of Northumbria in England. In an act of profound hubris, he chose to attack with only 2 ships, believing that his reputation and the favor of the gods were all the army he needed. This decision proved to be a fatal miscalculation. He was met on the shores of England by the forces of King Glar of Northumbria. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Ragnar's small force was crushed, and he himself was captured alive. King Glar, faced with the most famous and feared Viking of his time, chose a punishment that was designed to be as cruel and as humiliating as possible. He ordered Ragnar to be thrown into a deep pit filled with venomous snakes, to be slowly bitten to death. It is in this final, horrifying moment that the psychological portrait of the ideal Viking warrior is painted in its most vivid colors. As he stood at the edge of the snake pit, the legendary Ragnar did not beg for his life. He did not weep. He did not show fear. According to the sagas, he faced his doom with a defiant laugh. He used his final moments to deliver a chilling prophecy, a final act of psychological warfare against his captors. He spoke of his sons, the formidable warriors, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, and their brothers. He warned King Glar that his death would not be an end, but a beginning. He famously declared, "The little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." This is the very soul of the Viking ethos. Even in the face of a terrifying and painful death, Ragnar's primary concern was not his own suffering, but his legacy. His final words were not a plea for mercy, but a promise of a terrible and bloody revenge, to be carried out by his sons. He was ensuring that his story would not end with his death, but would continue in the sagas of their vengeance. And then, he was cast into the pit. The sagas describe his death with a kind of grim admiration. He stood among the vipers, stoic and defiant, until the poison finally overcame him. He died not as a victim, but as a warrior, meeting his preordained fate with a courage that would become the stuff of legend. Whether this event actually happened as the sagas describe is impossible to know for certain. The historical Regenerus, a possible inspiration for Ragnar, met a similarly brutal end. But the story of the snake pit, whether it is fact or fiction, is a perfect and powerful ending for the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok. It is an ending that encapsulates everything the Vikings valued: a defiance of death, a deep belief in fate, and the absolute certainty that a glorious death in the face of the enemy was the ultimate key to immortality. Ragnar's final words were not a cry of despair, they were a declaration of war. His prophecy, "The little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers," was carried across the North Sea by the winds of fate and rumor. When the news of their father's horrifying death reached his sons Ivar, the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Uber and Halfdan, the reaction was not one of sorrow, but of cold, calculating fury. The time for raiding was over. The time for conquest had begun. What happened next was an event unprecedented in the history of the Viking Age. In the year 865, a massive Viking fleet, larger than any that had ever been assembled before, gathered to invade England. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, written by the terrified monks who witnessed its arrival, did not call it an army. They called it the Great Heathen Army. This was not a small raiding party seeking treasure. It was a full-scale invasion force, numbering in the thousands, a coalition of warriors from across Scandinavia, all united under the banner of Ragnar's sons. Their singular unifying purpose was to exact a terrible and bloody revenge on one man, King Glar of Northumbria. From a psychological perspective, this event is a powerful demonstration of the importance of kinship and legacy in the Norse world. The sons were not just avenging a father, they were fulfilling a sacred duty. To fail to avenge their father's brutal murder would be an act of profound dishonor, a stain on their family name that would echo through the generations. Their rage was not just personal, it was a cultural imperative. Led by the strategic and ruthless genius of Ivar the Boneless, the Great Heathen Army landed on the shores of East Anglia, not as raiders, but as an occupying force. They did not just pillage and leave, they made camp, they demanded tribute, and they prepared for a long and brutal war. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, which were divided and constantly fighting amongst themselves, were completely unprepared for this new kind of enemy. The Great Heathen Army was a unified, disciplined, and highly mobile force. They swept across the land, conquering the city of York and establishing it as their capital. The dream of a small, English colony in a new world was now being answered by the nightmare of a large, Viking colony in the heart of England. The sons of Ragnar were not just there to kill a king, they were there to claim a kingdom, and the final, bloody chapter of Ragnar's story was about to be written in the fields of Northumbria. The Great Heathen Army was a force of nature, a storm of violence that the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could not repel. After securing their base in York, Ivar the Boneless, a master strategist, despite his physical ailment, marched his army into the heart of Northumbria. King Glar, the man who had ordered Ragnar's death, finally understood the horrifying reality of the prophecy that had been delivered from the edge of the snake pit. The grunting of the little pigs was now a thunderous roar at his own castle gates. In 867, at the Battle of York, King Glar's forces were decisively crushed by the disciplined Viking army. The king himself was captured alive. For the sons of Ragnar, this was not a moment for negotiation or ransom. This was a moment for a ritual, a final, horrifying act of vengeance that would be so terrible, so unforgettable, that it would be immortalized in the sagas forever. According to the Norse sagas, the sons of Ragnar subjected King Glar to the most infamous and brutal of all Viking execution methods, the blood eagle. Let us conduct a psychological autopsy on this horrifying ritual. The blood eagle was not designed to be a quick or merciful death. It was an act of supreme, symbolic cruelty, a piece of terrifying theater designed to utterly annihilate an enemy, both physically and spiritually. The procedure, as described in the sagas, was a two-part act of ritualistic butchery. First, the victim's back was carved with the outline of an eagle's wings. Then, the executioner, using a sword or an axe, would hack through the ribs, breaking them away from the spine. The lungs were then pulled out through the wounds in the back and laid over the shoulders, creating the gruesome illusion of a pair of bloody, folded wings. The victim, it is said, would remain alive through most of this process, dying a slow, agonizing death from suffocation and blood loss. The purpose of this ritual was not just to inflict pain, it was to inflict the ultimate humiliation. It was a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war, a way to publicly display the absolute dominance of the victor. For the sons of Ragnar, performing the blood eagle on their father's killer was the final bloody punctuation mark on their saga of revenge. It was an act that would ensure both their father's honor and their own fearsome reputations would live forever. Now, we must ask the historian's question: did this actually happen? The historical reality of the blood eagle is a subject of intense debate among modern scholars. There is no definitive archaeological evidence that the ritual was ever performed exactly as the sagas describe. The sagas themselves are poems, written centuries after the events, and prone to dramatic and gory embellishment. It is entirely possible that the blood eagle was a literary invention, a piece of dark fiction created by later Christian scribes to portray the Vikings as monstrous, bloodthirsty pagans. But even if it was a literary invention, its psychological power is undeniable. The idea of the blood eagle, the very fact that it was conceived of and written down, gives us a chilling window into the Viking mind. It shows us a culture that was not only comfortable with extreme violence, but one that could elevate it into a form of high symbolic art. Whether fact or fiction, the legend of King Gla's demise at the hands of Ragnar's sons served its purpose. The great heathen army had avenged its fallen hero. They had not just conquered a kingdom, they had destroyed a king in the most terrifying way imaginable. And with this final brutal act, the shadow of Ragnar Lothbrok was permanently etched into the history of England. The death of King Gla was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of a new era. The great heathen army, having fulfilled its vengeful purpose, did not simply pack up and sail home. They stayed. For the next decade, they waged a relentless campaign of conquest, toppling the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. They established a vast territory in England that would come to be known as the Danelaw, a land ruled by Viking law and custom. The sons of Ragnar had not just avenged their father, they had fundamentally and permanently changed the course of English history. And what of Ragnar Lothbrok himself? He achieved the one thing a Viking warrior desired above all else: immortality. His story, a perfect blend of historical possibility and mythic grandeur, became one of the most celebrated of all the Norse sagas. He was no longer just a man. He was an archetype, the very embodiment of the Viking spirit. Let us conduct our final psychological autopsy, not on the man, but on the legend itself. Why has the story of Ragnar Lothbrok endured for over 1,000 years, captivating audiences from the medieval mead halls to the modern television screen? The answer is that his saga is a perfect anatomy of a hero's journey, told through the dark and brutal lens of the Viking worldview. It is a story of a humble man who rises to become a great king. It is a story of glorious victories and a tragic, hubristic fall. It is a story of a horrifying death, and a final, apocalyptic revenge. It contains all the elements of a timeless epic. But more than that, the legend of Ragnar serves a crucial psychological purpose. It gives a single human face to a vast and terrifying historical phenomenon. The Viking Age was a chaotic and often anonymous period of violence. Ragnar Lothbrok provides a central character, a protagonist, through which we can understand the ambition, the courage, and the profound brutality of that time. He is the ghost that gives the entire era its form. In the end, it does not matter if the real Ragnar Lothbrok actually existed as a single person. The legend of Ragnar is real. It is a powerful and enduring testament to a culture that valued fame above life, and a story so compelling that it has echoed through the ages. He is a historical figure whose greatest creation was not a kingdom, but his own immortal myth. And so, the final investigation is now passed to you. After dissecting the sagas, the history, and the psychology of the Viking mind, what do you believe is the most important lesson from the story of Ragnar Lothbrok? Leave your theory in the comments below. Let's continue the discussion about this legendary warrior and the brutal world he inhabited. Because the story of Ragnar Lothbrok teaches us one final, chilling lesson. Sometimes, the most powerful force in history is not an army or a king, but a story that refuses to die.